Thanks for giving me a chance to see all of you. I'm seeing a lot of wonderful faces here. And especially, I just want to note Carol, Peter, Larry. They're old friends, and it's great to see them. And my people refer to them as mensches. It's really great to see them. But I especially want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to sort of stretch beyond my comfort zone in preparing for today. As David said, I speak and I write to liberty often, in the classroom, in the courtroom, in the living room. But since I thought of McLeish primarily as a poet, I decided that when thinking about that, I rarely speak to poetry. I never write to poetry. And so I thought it was a good thing for me to do to try to stretch myself and speak to poetry today, that facet of the many facets of McLeish that I always knew him for. And I know that the educators in the room will say it's a good thing to try to stretch beyond your comfort zone. And so therefore, you'll suffer the consequences of my doing so. And therefore, the title, On Words and Liberty. On words. Now, as an attorney and as a professor, words are the tools of both trades. And whether they're used in the classroom or whether I write them for the Supreme Court, I use them to try to achieve clarity. Please don't snicker when I say that the law should be all about clarity. If a law is written in a way that its admonition is unclear, it should be deemed unconstitutional. We call that void for vagueness. If a law is written in a way that's overly broad, such that it is subject to an interpretation applicable to many different situations, that too is unconstitutional. So despite all the stereotypes about our doublespeak and about fine print, good law is all about being concrete and exacting and speaking to a shared experience, or at least to a shared understanding. To comply with law, we at a minimum must understand it. Now, I've come to doubt during the last few weeks in preparing for today that clarity is the driving aspiration for the poet. I'm not suggesting that a poem should be hard to understand, and certainly not so for the sake of being hard to understand. In fact, I think that makes for bad poetry. But the poem should reward study. McLeish writes, and it's quoted in your program, that a poem should not mean, but be. Maybe that explains why poetry isn't nearly as widely read as fiction or as the novel. I've had the good fortune of meeting Poet Laureate of the United States, Richard Wilbur, and of hearing him read on several occasions. And he says there are more writers of poetry than there are readers of poetry. And why is it? Why is it that novels are more likely to be read? I think it's because we all love the story, and the novel is all about the story. So here I am in the well of this theater filled with lovers of poetry, and I'm still not sure if I can define what it is, let alone take ownership of its nexus to my passion, liberty. As I said, it isn't for lack of study these last few weeks. I've been reading about it, about rhyme and rhythm and alliteration, about the use of metaphor and simile and personification, about constructing tension followed by surprise, about weaving patterns of repetition, even about the value of inventing words. But all of that, that's just technique. That doesn't explain what the medium is, or even come close to explaining why of poetry. So in previous drafts of this presentation, I tried to fashion for myself, because that's what I do, an articulable understanding of the poetic process. And I came to this conclusion that first there's a stimulus. It could be something as tangible as this theater, as the moon. It could be something intangible, our adoration for McLeish, or springtime. I then speculated that you then have to search for your response to that stimulus, something I just called self-exploration. And then you have to express that reaction to the outside world using imagination or one of those techniques that we talked about before. And in previous drafts, I spoke to the need for that process, in order for it to be an honest expression of self, that it must be free of constraint. It must be free of interference. So I then planned to cite some outrageous examples of governmental interference with that creative process. Censorship, of course, being the most draconian on that continuum of possible interference. And voila, there was my thesis on words and liberty, that in the absence of unfettered freedom, the creative process is thwarted. And I was pleased until I realized I was wrong. The odd truth of the relationship between liberty and poetry is that while liberty is an accelerant for those flames of creativity, that self-expression, the absence of liberty, that's long been the cause of, it's fomented some of the best art, some of the best creative work that we have. And I don't have to look any further than that dreadful detention center at Guantanamo Bay that David was alluding to moments ago. A couple of years ago, my colleague and friend, Mark Falkoff, collected the work of dozens of prisoner poets at Guantanamo. And he created a volume that was published. Gore Vidal said of that book, "At last, Guantanamo has found its voice." Upon release of the work, I was pleased to be asked to do readings as the local Guantanamo guy at the Broadside in Northampton and at the Amherst bookstore. When we look at how these poems were created and distributed, nowhere will you see anything resembling liberty. In the early days of the prison camp, these men were denied names, let alone paper and pen. But Falkoff explains in his preface that some of the prisoners felt such an overwhelming desire to express themselves in verse that they would take a pebble during their 1 hour of release time outside in a cage, and they would carve short 2 or 3 line poems into the styrofoam cups that they were given at lunchtime. One poem by Sheikh Abdurrahim Muslim Dost, recalled from memory after his release from Guantanamo a few years ago, said, "What kind of spring is this, where there are no flowers and the air is filled with this miserable smell?" These transient cup poems would be passed among the detainees from the cell block, within the cell block. Inevitably, they'd be collected with the evening trash and destroyed. So there's that question for me again in preparing for today. Why poetry? But when I thought about it, this urge to create, the need to maintain life even in a wasteland like Guantanamo, it is familiar to me. I'd like to tell you about one of my clients, the one that David mentioned earlier, Fari Saeed bin Mohammed, or as the government calls him, number 311. He was held in isolation for 7.5 years before being reassigned to Camp 4, where he could finally congregate with other detainees. And that only happened because we won that case David mentioned, and the court found that 2 presidents had illegally detained him for 8.5 years. And after that declaration, he was moved to Camp 4. For years, I'd met with Fari, who of course is always chained to the floor during our hours and hours of conversation. I'm one of those fortunate habeas lawyers, and it's dumb luck of the draw for all 7 of them that my clients were willing to give me the greatest gift any human can give another human: trust, and eventually friendship. And I mentioned Fari because early in our relationship, I asked him how he survived all those hours after hours, days after days, years after years in isolation. How does he maintain his sanity? And he explained to me, since he was a teenager, Fari had worked as a laborer in the building trades. And in his cell, Fari would construct the house that he dreamed he would build once he was free, once he'd regained his freedom. And just as he'd been trained, Fari worked in his cell with masonry blocks that would be mortared together carefully and then stuccoed for their exterior sheathing. And within this 8 foot by 6 feet 8 inch by 8 feet tall cell, he'd build a home. He designed it in his mind. And at the end of the day, when it was time to turn in, he'd remember that he ended the day by putting the first masonry block on that 3rd window on the north wall. And in the morning, after showering and morning prayers and breakfast, he'd resume his work by putting the 2nd masonry block on that 3rd window on the north wall. One visit, he told me he had to remove a whole portion of the house. Why, I said. He said, because even though I'm 49 by the lunar calendar, he was 49, when I'm released, I may still be able to marry and have children, and I have to add a wing just in case. So he added a wing with 2 bedrooms and deconstructed a portion of the home so he could start again and have it meet his expectation. While I'm talking about Fari, I should tell you that Fari is a lover of food, not only from his childhood with rich cuisine of North Africa, Algeria, but also from spending 7 years in France as a laborer and 3 years in Italy. Where else do you learn to love food? But at Guantanamo, he developed a terrible malabsorption disorder from the foods that he was served. And it plagued him, and it resulted in these awful manifestations in his skin that I won't describe for you, but it also prevented him from eating the foods that he loved. But he still insisted that my co-counsel, Jerry Cohen, and I, every visit, that we bring him the most complicated recipes that we could find to be translated through our translator to him, like bouillabaisse with a Ruiz sauce, all of which begins with a fish stock that you make days in advance out of fish heads and tails and bones, and he would cook those. He'd memorize those recipes from when we met with him, and he'd take them back to his cell, repeating as we're giving it to him to make sure that he locks them in his memory. And then he would create those dishes in his imagination. He'd wait 2 days while the stock was curing. And he cooked them in an imaginary kitchen that was made of the same stuff of the foods. Mark Falkoff tells similar stories about how several of his clients squirreled away cantaloupe and tomato seeds from their meals so that when they're given an opportunity, that rare opportunity to be outdoors, they would plant the seeds in whatever rocky soil they could find among the prison's concrete walkways. And they knew, of course, that without the ability to regularly water those seedlings or tend to them, they would amount to nothing. But planting those seeds, that was an affirmation. It was an affirmation of their humanity. It was an effort to stave off despair. It was a gesture of hope. Writing poetry, I think, performed much of the same function for these poet prisoners of Guantanamo. Mark compiled some of these poems to make them available to the public. But it's hard to do that because all of our clients' letters and in-person communications were classified, some of which were released yesterday, by the way, in WikiLeaks. It's timely, isn't it? Anything they say to us can only be made public with the approval of the Pentagon Classification Review Team. Every one of us, habeas lawyers, will tell you that clearing anything through that censorship team was, at a minimum, difficult and often impossible. You know, for example, that it took years for our first efforts to make public allegations of torture. It was just incredibly unsuccessful on our parts. Our notes that were returned with a secret stamp were deemed unsuitable for public release on grounds that they revealed interrogation methods and techniques which shouldn't be shared with the public, that the military had a legitimate interest in keeping them undisclosed. Only after litigation was threatened did the Pentagon reconsider its classification decisions on some of these things and allow the public finally to begin to hear, albeit in a mediated way from the prisoners themselves through us. Like any other communication from our clients, these poems had to pass through the same process before they could be discussed in public. Many, 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 many of the poems were never cleared by the Pentagon. Mark learned of thousands of lines of poetry that were destroyed or confiscated by the military before they could be shared with the lawyers, even before we saw them, and they were addressed to us. The military confiscated nearly all 25,000 lines of poetry composed by Sheikh Abdurrahim Muslim Dost, for example, returning to him only a handful of them upon his release from Guantanamo about 3 years ago. In addition, after the Pentagon learned that poems were being collected by Mark with the intent to publish them, the censorship team stopped clearing them altogether, stating that it had concluded that poetry, this is a quote, presents a special risk to national security because of its content and format. However, before the Pentagon issued that edict banning the clearance of poetry, Mark was able to collect a sufficient number to merit publication. I should hold up his book and push it, right? With his permission, I'll share Mark's explanation that the poems are not susceptible to easy categorization. Some are moving descriptions of despair, as you might imagine, such as Jumad al-Dosari's haunting death poem, in which he asks his readers to take my blood, take my death shroud and the remnants of my body, take photographs of my corpse at the grave, lonely. Mark explains that these lines are more than a memento mori. In his poem, Dosari envisions his dead body as an incarnate indictment of us, of an American society that would allow innocence to suffer meaningless torment. His catalog of despair must, he writes, be sent to the judges, to the people of conscience, so that they might bear the guilty burden before the world of this innocent soul, of this wasted, sinless soul, of this soul which has suffered at the hands of the protectors of peace, at the hands of the protectors of peace. This poem is particularly unsettling when the context in which it was drafted is taken into consideration. By the military's own account, Dosari attempted suicide more than a dozen times while at Guantanamo, including once when his lawyer, Josh Coangelo Bryant, returned from a break in their meeting to find him hanging from his cell, blood pooling at his feet from a gash in his arm. Other poems gain power through the urgency of their message, such as Hunger Strike poem by Mark's client, Adnan Farhan Abdul Latif. It's an attempt to supplement in verse his firsthand accounts of the pain of hunger striking. Latif had refused nourishment for months to protest his continuing incarceration without trial, without charges. He had endured force feeding twice daily, which includes being strapped into a restraint chair and having a plastic feeding tube inserted through his nasal passage and down into his stomach. He describes the experience as being like having a dagger shoved down your throat. In his poem, Latif Riley describes the soldiers who subject him to this torturous ritual as poets in their own right. They are artists of pain and of fatigue. They are artists of insult and humiliation. In the last analysis, his poem asks the same basic question as Dosari's. Where is the world to save us from torture? Where is the world to save us from the fire and the sadness? Several of the poems are profound in their seeming simplicity. Sadiq Turkestani's Even If the Pain, for example. On first reading, it appears perfectly forthright, but when he writes at the close of the poem that there must be a day when we will get out, in one line, he simultaneously expresses both hope and doubt about his future. Lying behind his poem, too, is a remarkable story. This time of military bungling, of bewildering injustice. Turkestani is one of those ethnic Uyghurs you may have read about, who, while traveling in Afghanistan, he was abducted by members of Al-Qaeda, and he was tortured until he confessed under torture to plotting to kill Osama bin Laden. He was imprisoned by the Taliban at Kandahar until 2001, when we invaded. And when U.S. intelligence personnel visited the jail, he told them his story, and he was promised a quick release. Instead, he was eventually sent to Guantanamo, and he was held for 4 years on accusations that included being associated with his captors, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Before the military determined that he was not an enemy combatant, which they determined in January of 2005. And still, Turkestani was not released from Guantanamo for nearly 6 months. His poem was discovered by one of his lawyers during the lawyer's first visit to Guantanamo. And this was the same visit during which the lawyer learned that the military had found Turkestani innocent 4 months earlier. Something the Justice Department had thus far failed or refused to reveal to the lawyers. Turkestani had sketched his poem into the sail of a ship that another Uyghur prisoners had drawn and taped to the wall of their quarters in Camp Iguana, where they had been moved months earlier in anticipation of their ultimate release. I should tell you that Iguana is the lowest level of security in Guantanamo. They can cook together, they can eat together. It's those people that the U.S. acknowledged, our bad, they were mistakes. So they were allowed to congregate, they were allowed to have pen, they were allowed to read papers. Other poems, like Ibrahim al-Rubaish's Ode to the Sea, my favorite, are rich in imagery and thematic complexity. Rubaish's poem is an extended monologue delivered by the poet and addressed to the Caribbean Sea, which surrounds Guantanamo. Rubaish envisions the sea as a potential ally, albeit one who obviously cannot be trusted. Were it not for the chains of the faithless, I would have dived into you and reached my beloved family, or perished in your arms. Your beaches are sadness, captivity, pain, and injustice. Your bitterness eats away at my patience. Your calm is like death. Your sweeping waves are strange. The silence that rises up from you holds treachery in its fold. Why, Rubaish asks, after witnessing the injustices taking place on the shore, has the sea failed to act as savior for the prisoners of Guantanamo? O sea, you taunt us in our captivity. You have colluded with our enemies and you cruelly guard us. Don't the rocks tell you of the crimes committed in their midst? Doesn't Cuba, the vanquished, translate its stories for you? In its complacency, we're told, the sea has become complicit in the inequities of this prison camp. The conceit is merely meant to be an indictment of the American public's own complacency in the face of revelations about the injustices of Guantanamo. 3 years into that Guantanamo experiment, Rubaish asks both the sea and his readers, what have you gained? The answer is not justice, or safety, or peace of mind. The answer is cryptically, boats of poetry on the sea, a buried flame in a burning heart. My point is that although liberty is nowhere to be found in the Guantanamo wasteland, poetry has flourished, as it had for the father of my juvenile client, Abdul Salam al-Shahiri. The father sent me a poem to deliver to the apple of my eye, describing the stains on his face left by the tears for his son. As an example of fine poetry, it may never have warranted notice, but as an expression of the heart, it was world class. Except that the military censors stamped it with the classified designation, and I was not permitted to give it to Abdul Salam for a very long time. The theory behind that was that it might contain some hidden message from the outside that this child could use in his isolation cell for some nefarious purpose. But when I showed that poem to Abdul Salam finally, its purpose was clear and was anything but nefarious. This boy who grew up in Guantanamo, he had seen things that you'd think could only harden and embitter. But when that poem was in the hut with us, it made him all but melt. His eyes moistened a gentle smile, and he looked at us only to say a breathy shukran, thank you for delivering the poem. And it felt to me as if that boy's father was in the hut with us, gently stroking his child's hair. And liberty, well, when I saw him read that poem, I knew that was the first whiff of freedom that he'd had since he'd been taken into custody 4 years before. Before we close, I'd like to tell you of a night I spent in August of 1997. Our daughter, I'm going to sound kind of proud right now, our daughter was receiving her master's at Oxford University. So we happily crossed the pond for that proud celebration. And while we were there, we decided to take a little road trip, finding lodging as we traveled across the UK. And one day, we ended up in the village of St. David's in Wales, named after a 6th century cathedral in its center. And we got the name of a nice little bed and breakfast outside of town called the Old Bishop's Mill. And we met the owners and we dropped our luggage off in the room in the afternoon, and then we went out touring and found a nice place to eat. And after dinner at a restaurant in town, we returned to the B&B at about 9 o'clock or so. And we opened the door to about a dozen people sitting around a large dining room table with glasses in hand and books and papers spread out in front of them. And we awkwardly apologized because we were interrupting. We tried to scurry past this gathering and get to our guest room, but our hospitable hosts would have none of it, and they insisted that we pull up chairs and join the group, which we did. That group, it turned out, had gathered together for years on Saturday nights. And on each of those nights, they dined together. and drink what turned out to be prodigious amounts of spirits together and read poetry aloud to each other. They filled our glass and they resumed the readings that we'd interrupted. And we sat there delighted and mesmerized, listening to poem after poem, glass after glass, until by midnight my wife simply ran out of gas and she went to bed. On the other hand, I followed the advice of Dylan Thomas. I refused to go gently into that good night. And David and his friends continued to read with great enthusiasm. And it was obvious that inflection and pauses and cadence and the sound of the work was important to them. And after each reading, there were comments, and sometimes some good-natured ribbing, sometimes a toast to the reader or to the poet or to the things spoken about in the poem, or an approving pounding on the table. And there I sat until about 2 a.m. when the last friend had left, leaving only our host David and me at the table. And I learned then that some of the poems that I'd heard had been read to the same group time and time again over the years. It was a liturgy of sorts, an homage not only to the poets, but to the poetry. I didn't crawl into bed until about 3 a.m., and only after hearing his personal story of the role that poetry played in the Welsh culture and in his own life. And there it is. After all the thought that I put into preparing words for you today, my relationship to poetry had already been forged in my own experiences. And I suppose that's true for all of us. David and his Welsh friends celebrate the poem because they're free to do so. They do it not only for its voice and not only for its message, they celebrate it because they're free to have it add meaning to their lives. And I think that's true for the Guantanamo poet prisoners as well. Their creativity, that's their greatest source of freedom. By expressing themselves, they become freer, even under those conditions. And my message here, it's one that you already know. This tribute, this annual tribute, your remembrance of MacLeish, your commitment to keep his work alive, that is your liturgy. It's a liturgy that uses the written and the spoken word. And it is, more than anything else, a celebration of liberty. Thank you.
Do we have a Q&A now?
Thank you.
Others willing to take some questions if you have any.
But I wanted to turn to another matter that concerns me, that has to do with the First Amendment rights, and particularly the recent Supreme Court decision having to do with the Westboro Baptist Church. Which, you familiar with that?
Yes, I sure am.
Yeah. I was going to run around the school carrying a sign saying, "Thanks, burning in hell," which I thought I could do since I'm one of them.
Yeah.
But I was appalled by that decision, and I thought, there's some relationship, and I know the court is saying we can say pretty much what we want to say, even if it hurts other people. In this area, in the valley, we've been particularly concerned about bullying, the Phoebe Prince case. And the damage that was done is still being done. I think I just read about double suicide yesterday. Two teenage girls who jointly committed suicide because of bullying. I want to know, what is the difference between what the Westboro Baptist Church is having those awful flags at funerals of servicemen, but also, for instance, at Matthew Shepard's funeral. What is the difference between those words and bullying? Isn't that bullying? Isn't bullying somehow forbidden, even under the guise of free speech?
I think it's a good question. I think the answer is the setting and the age. We have a civil liberties scholar right here, Pete, who could probably answer this question himself. The leading case is the Tinker case, the armband case of middle school teenagers during the Vietnam War. And they were suspended for wearing a black armband. And the court wrote that their First Amendment rights were contingent upon how disruptive they were going to be and whether or not they offend or damage other students in the classroom. And I think the bullying examples are different because of that setting. For those of you who don't know, the case, the recent Supreme Court case that Ben is talking about is one in which a small, virtually one family from a little sect, a fundamentalist sect, was going around to military funerals and protesting, saying that these soldiers died because the Army let homosexuals in. And obviously very hurtful to the family that was burying their children or spouses or fathers. At the same time, what the court said is that's the very kind of speech, religious speech, is what we invented the First Amendment for. Now, in that particular case, I'm not sure how much people read about it, but there was a state statute that actually addressed that issue and said that you have to be at least 1,000 feet from the burial, any protest, any demonstration, any burial. That wasn't case specific, it was talking in general, because sometimes people want to protest somebody who dies for any number of reasons. As long as they get a permit first, which means notice that they're going to do it in a safe place, and they stay within 1,000, no closer than 1,000 feet, that the statute said that it was legal. So what was at issue there was that statute, and whether or not, and now these people complied with it. They were 1,200 feet away. Actually, the family at the burial never even knew that it happened, didn't even hear their protests until later. I celebrate that decision, one of the few ones that I celebrate from this court, because it was all about protecting the minority voice. That's why we have a First Amendment. And this was both political speech and religious speech, which is why we have a First Amendment. And it involved assembly, which is why we have a First Amendment. So I think the court absolutely got it right, as offensive as that speech is. And you'll remember, Ben, when Nazis marched through Skokie, where Holocaust victims lived, and the ACLU insisted on supporting them, even though the ACLU lost 60% of its contributors the next year. Many Jews who were so offended that these Holocaust victims had to see swastikas and parade in front of their yard. That's why we have a First Amendment. Unpopular speech, as much as that's affrontive speech, I hate that speech in both those instances. But if they can't speak, then maybe I couldn't have just read what I did. So I respectfully disagree with you. I do, however, understand why it's so offensive.
I want to know what is the difference between bullying and that kind of...
Children are different. So what can happen in and around the school, what children can do, is different than adults. They have some rights, but their rights are a little bit different. And that's the basic answer, that schools stand in loco parentis, that as a matter of law, they're there to protect children from other children as well. And speech. If speech is disruptive in the classroom, it's interfering with the educational process, you can curtail that speech. And we know that even in a free speech scenario, you still can't yell fire in a crowded theater, so don't.
I wonder about the language barrier at Guantanamo. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are some people who got there I was what they call the third wave of lawyers in November. The court said that they have a right to habeas corpus in January 28th of 2004. I came in November. There had been a small cadre of lawyers that brought that case to the Supreme Court called Rasool in 2004, and they took all the Brits. They took the British and English-speaking guys for obvious reasons. The second wave took the rest of the English-speaking guys, and by the time I got there, it was Pashto and Urdu and all these, to me, exotic languages. Most of mine speak Arabic. We have interpreters. Some interpreters and translators have made very good livings over these past 8-9 years out of Guantanamo. Ours, they're always there. They, just like us, have to get we have to get national security clearance to be able to deal with this stuff. That process takes some months. And depending on the case, sometimes I'll have to be upped for specific reasons. It's top secret security clearance. And then you get booted down depending on what you're dealing with. Our interpreters all have top secret security clearance. And we pay them $1,200 a day, most of them, sometimes $1,400 a day, to sit there with us in those huts or in those cells for usually 4.5 hours in the morning. Then we break for lunch and prayers, and then we come back, and usually from 1 o'clock till 5:30, and they sit with us and they interpret. It's exhausting. It's exhausting for them. They're very, very good at it. I understand to the extent that I can know that. These poems had to suffer the indignity of being translated for us, and but that's how we do it. That's how we do it. And we have Fari, who I mentioned, is now in Algeria. He was released a few months ago to Algeria, and after years of me imploring him, I would buy these little first grade. I actually consulted with Charlotte once on what's the best way to have a self-study, get books through so they can learn a little bit of English so they'll be more attractive to receiving countries once they've been cleared for transfer or release. And I had him studying English, and he insisted on using Arabic. And then I finally got to speak to him after he was in Algeria. I got through to him through his human rights attorney, and he picked up her cell phone. "Buzz, how are you?" I said, "Fari, are you speaking English?" "Yes." "How long have you been able to speak to me in English?" He said, "Oh, a year or two. I didn't want to tell you." But I'm glad that he's doing well. So that's how we do it. Alan.
Buzz, in your opinion, and I know it's just your opinion, the President of the United States ran in 2008 saying he was going to close Guantanamo, and he was a pretty reasonable president. He knows, he's a lawyer, he knows about torture, and why is Guantanamo still open, and why are these horrific actions being taken against some people who are innocent and some people we don't know whether they're innocent or not?
My answer, in my opinion, two parts. The first part of your question about the president and his intentions, I could answer with, a 4-digit number, 2012. That's what I think. The other thing that's happened is our Congress, some of the ugliest pandering that imaginable has, since 2007, after they passed what was called the Detainee Treatment Act, there was a judge in D.C. who, with one of the Uyghurs who I mentioned, he found out that the government had known that they were innocent since November of 2002, and they'd been held at that point for 6 years almost in Guantanamo. So the judge put the Justice Department to its proof, and it conceded in open court with documents which were classified and have since become unclassified. We concede that none of those Uyghurs were ever guilty, were never enemy combatants. We knew they were innocent, and he addressed all the judge's questions. So the judge did what I think any reasonable judge would do. This was on a Tuesday, and he ordered that by Friday, those Uyghurs be brought from Guantanamo to his courtroom in Washington, D.C., and the government show cause why they shouldn't be released. And the Justice Department appealed on the basis that the third branch, the judiciary, had no control over the two political branches in matters of immigration. Congress had the right to set immigration law, and only the president had the right to execute it, to enforce it. And because these men didn't have visas, the court would be creating law by saying they could come and be let out of the courthouse door into Washington, D.C., or otherwise brought to the United States. Congress immediately fashioned to the defense, you guys know about appropriations and authorizations, the bills for money, budget stuff. Same thing happens in Massachusetts this month, where there will be defense authorization bill in Washington authorizing a certain amount of money for the military, and then supplemental budgets for Iran, Iraq, and the war on terror. And then there'll be an actual appropriations. Well, they attached to the authorization and appropriations a rider that said, but if the president tries to bring these men to the United States, that the military will be unfunded, the $511 billion in the budget, as an amendment, a rider to the bill. That's how passionate Congress was about it. That was a Republican Congress, so we all held our breath thinking, okay, the Democratic Congress will be different. It wasn't. Broke my heart. Wasn't. There's the danger of bringing these guys here to the United States, that if they weren't terrorists beforehand, they're going to be terrorists now, and that they'll do terrible things. So I just think it's a crass example of political pandering and deplorable. And time and again, I thought that he should just veto that, let the Republicans be responsible for defunding the military. But that seems not to be where our president thinks his interests lie, or our interests lie. I don't know. So that's my answer.
What about not opening trials in the United States? They just decided
That's part of the same bill. And acquiescing to the congressional mandate as part of those negotiations that happened over the budget, and that the president and Eric Holder announced that we give up. We won't give them trials. So they're going to be in military commissions. Those five, anyway, will be Nashiri and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed will be tried down in Guantanamo before military commissions with relaxed evidentiary standards, and a jury comprised of military officers and prosecutors who are military officers and defense attorneys who are military officers. So I deplore that. You know, I wasn't clear enough in my words, I realized as I was saying them, but what we've always asked for is just charges. Charge them with something. There's only been 19 out of 789 that have been 779 that have ever been charged with anything. And a lot of those charges were rescinded during this process that you're talking about, which, whether it should be the Code of Military Justice to try them, or our federal courts, which are in the business of trying people for crimes. And only a small handful, I think 4, have actually gone through trials or pleaded guilty. Now these 5 will make it a total of 9 if they actually have proceedings go forward. Out of 779, it should take your breath away. These people were held without ever being charged with anything to this moment. And that just ain't what America's supposed to be about. Talk about liberty. Cool.
I know you spent some time trying to catch up on the news today about what's being leaked, about not knowing it had nothing against. Anyway, could you say what's been reviewed?
Sure. I was just reviewing it because what I did is I printed some articles. If anybody wants to look in The Guardian, there's I think a really interesting summary of the WikiLeaks about Guantanamo that were released yesterday. It's hard for me because there's nothing new in here, what I've read, but that's because I've been allowed to go down to this secure facility in or around the Pentagon. That's what I have to say, and been reading this stuff forever. Some of it has to do with 2 of my clients I just read about. They're public now, much in the way the Pentagon Papers became public now. Sort of in a similar way, not quite, but some of the people that, it's history. These documents are historical in nature, although some of the New York Times deleted the names of interrogators from a lot of these documents, and the names of informants, thinking that some of the primary objections to the release would be that it imperils those people who actually participated in the interrogations or informed on other detainees or Taliban. I think it's so great that the American public can read some of this stuff. I can't wait to actually look at the documents and see I think there's hundreds and thousands of them, and therein lies the problem. I'm sure you all have time to look at hundreds and thousands of documents and try to understand what happened, but the whole process, the secrecy, has been our greatest enemy. The fact that you couldn't know what was happening, the fact that Guantanamo was done, and it remains your greatest enemy. I mean, Alan, really, the president's, I've never been in favor of closing Guantanamo. I think that's just geography. And if you take them to Thompson, Illinois, to some maximum security prison, for people like my Palestinian who's been in Camp 4, the one where he can congregate with other people. He's been out of isolation for a year and a half. They want to move him back to isolation in Thompson, Illinois, to this supermax with enhanced security so that politically nobody can say you let these guys escape kind of thing, and they still won't be charged and still won't be tried. I mean, I was just looking very briefly at the New York Times broad article lifting the lid on the world's most controversial prison, and what it alleges is that the 172 men, out of those 604 of them have been released. There's 172 left. And it says that they're now the worst of the worst. Well, I'm going to share a secret with you that I think it's protected, it's not classified, and I'm not going to give you names. But I know either 84 or 88 of them have already been cleared for transfer by the Obama administration. Executive Order number 2, when he said he's closing Guantanamo, Obama said in that executive order, he created what's called the IART, the Interagency Review Team. 9 of the 15 cabinet-level departments were to get together, send high-ranking executives together, and create a means of looking at every single detainee's case who was still, at that time I think it was 240 men still at Guantanamo. And they did that through the Guantanamo Bay Review Team, and of them, either 84 or 88, this is accurate, I'm just not sure which of those numbers it is, were actually cleared for transfer, cleared for transfer. We can't find a country to take them because most countries say, and I've talked to foreign ministers, they say, if you're not going to take them, why should we? We have the same political issues. We have an opposition who's saying, why are you taking accused terrorists here? And who's going to feed them? And who's going to guarantee them shelter? And the U.S. refuses, Congress refuses to give them a stipend when they get resettled in another country. So to me, closing Guantanamo, you want to close, I want the treatment to stop. I want them charged. I want them tried. That's all we've ever asked for. And fairly to be charged and tried. Yes, sir.
When you say cleared for transfer, does that mean that the review process has discovered that there was no reason to hold them, and they're saying that there's still some reason they believe to keep them in prison, and they just want to move them to a different prison?
That's a great question, and they don't always tell us that when we get the notice that our client has been cleared. It used to say cleared for transfer or release. Now it just says transfer, which means to another country, resettled. And the language, it says it's in the interests of the United States foreign policy and national security for this person to be transferred out of Guantanamo. I mean, I think you could probably answer the question. You have 3 choices. And we're talking about now over 600 and whatever men have been, either the government knows that they're still terrorists and they're going to do something terrible and decides to let them go to do it. You can choose that as an explanation. Or you can choose as an explanation that the United States thinks that they're no longer a danger, or that they never were a danger. And so they don't really explain that when we get our notices, and I've had 4 of my clients transferred, and I've received those notices top secret. I can't tell you that they've been cleared for transfer, and then we negotiate with other countries and whatever to try to find a place for them. So I can't answer it, but I can't believe the U.S. knowingly puts out, notwithstanding what you might read in this about some of the sort of opinion it's engendered, puts out real hair of the dog terrorists to do their stuff again. Hi, Rick.
I just wanted to return the discussion for a minute to poetry.
Oh, good.
And I was remembering that Seamus Heaney was asked, how could you write poetry in a time of war? And he said, particularly in a time of war, is poetry relevant? And you so beautifully and poetically called attention to why people write poetry in the midst of inhuman situations. When you were talking about the scraping with the pebble on the styrofoam cup, and the man and Fari building his house, and this is poetry. And it's what reminds us, you know, in the midst of this unimaginable barbarity, that people retain their humanity. And you do that so beautifully.
Oh, thank you. I will say, taking piano lessons, I'm seeking my own poetry by taking piano lessons in my 60s, so thank you very much. This has been very good. Thank you. Thank you.